the Tower of Babel. A name most of us know as a symbol of human pride and a lesson about the consequences of defying God. But the truth is, the Tower of Babel was not merely an architectural failure, not just a story of an unfinished structure. It was far more terrifying than that. It was the first evidence of an organized rebellion, a collective conspiracy to overthrow the divine order established by God at the very dawn of creation. What happened at Babel was not just a group of builders trying to construct a skyscraping tower. It was the moment when humanity, for the first time since the Great Flood, united not to glorify God, but to replace Him. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves, not to seek holiness, but to establish their own kingdom, a kingdom that needed no God. This was not mere ambition. It was a silent but public declaration of war, a quiet but absolute rejection of the Creator. When everyone spoke the same language and shared the same ambition, they believed nothing could stop their dream of self-exaltation, and had there been no divine intervention, what would have become of humanity? A unified kingdom under human authority, boundless without divine law, needing no grace from the Creator. Have we truly grasped the horror hidden within this story? Do we realize that Babel is not just a moral tale for children in Sunday school? It is a piercing warning about what happens when humanity forgets its place in the divine order, when pride surpasses faithfulness, and when unity is twisted into a tool to oppose the very source of life. The story of the Tower of Babel, when seen in its true depth, is not confined to the past. It is a cold mirror reflecting the deepest ambitions of humanity across all ages, and especially in our own time today. When we think of the Tower of Babel, we often picture an unfinished structure, a tower reaching upward only to collapse, scattering humanity into different languages, unable to understand one another. But there is a truth rarely mentioned, a spiritual depth far beyond what the surface reveals. The Tower of Babel was not merely a physical construction. It was a direct challenge to the divine will of the Creator. When God gave humanity a second chance after the Great Flood, He commanded them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But instead of spreading out and building a diverse world under God's guidance, humanity chose to cluster together, uniting as one, not to serve, but to exalt themselves. They rejected the divine plan. They deliberately distorted the Creator's command, turning unity into a tool for absolute power. They did not want to spread out as God had decreed. They wanted to build a fortified city, erect a tower that touched the heavens, to make a name for themselves, to write their own destiny, without needing the blessing of heaven. And the consequence, God intervened not by destruction, as He had done in the flood, but by shattering their unity. Language was divided. Understanding dissolved. The nations scattered across the earth, no longer able to unite in their rebellious ambition. But deeper still, the greatest consequence was not just that humanity spoke different tongues. A crack appeared in the spiritual fabric of mankind, an invisible but profound loss. The harmony of human will with divine purpose was shattered. From that moment onward, human history became a story of division, not only in language, but in goals, beliefs, and understanding of existence itself. The Tower of Babel was not just a linguistic event. It was the beginning of a history in which humanity, fragmented by language, culture, and nation, struggled endlessly to find unity, but often did so by pushing God out of the equation. And that is the true tragedy, a spiritual fracture that still echoes today in every war, every ambition for domination, every attempt to build new towers, whether made of brick, steel, or modern dreams of globalization. After the Great Flood, the curtain of human history was drawn anew. All evil, all near total destruction had been swept from the earth in a severe but just act of God's judgment. Then, in a moment filled with hope, God made a covenant with Noah and his descendants, a covenant as radiant as the rainbow hanging in the sky. He would never again destroy all of humanity with water. This covenant was not just a guarantee, it was an invitation. Renew the world, live according to the divine order, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. For the first time since the cataclysm, humanity was given a fresh chance to walk in the light of grace, to build a world founded on mercy, justice, and faithfulness to God. But what became of that opportunity? At first it seemed humanity understood the lesson. Families grew, generations multiplied. But soon the human heart turned back to old ambitions. This time not in scattered efforts, but in a strange unified endeavor to gather together, build a city, and raise a tower that reached the heavens. Instead of spreading out, enriching the earth with the diversity God desired, they sought to centralize everything into a single seat of power. The first global empire where language, thought, and ambition merged into one, not to worship God, but to glorify themselves. They used the gift of life to defy the one who gave it. They turned the chance for renewal into a scheme for domination. They abandoned divine freedom to pursue a dangerous human power. And so instead of a world built on reverence and gratitude, Babel became the starting point for a new world. A world where pride led the way and estrangement from God became the norm. In the biblical perspective, this was not merely the failure of one generation. It was a reflection of the tragedy of human nature itself, given the chance for restoration, yet so quick to misuse it, repeating old mistakes in more sophisticated forms. And from there, the story of Babel and of all humanity entered a new chapter, a chapter of division, of rising and falling kingdoms, of endless dreams of power, with no God at the center. In the opening pages of the Bible, a mysterious figure suddenly emerges. Nimrod. Described briefly but with profound implication in Genesis, Nimrod is called the first hero on earth, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Genesis chapter 10, 8-9. But behind this heroic facade lies a dangerous symbol. Nimrod was not just a conqueror of beasts or lands. He was the first to directly challenge divine authority on earth. Nimrod's name, rooted in Hebrew, means "we will rebel," a name carrying deep undertones of defiance. Nimrod did not merely use his strength for survival. He gathered people under his rule, building the first cities after the flood, including Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, all in the land of Shinar, the heart of ancient Sumerian civilization. In traditions outside the Bible, such as the Book of Jubilees and Midrash texts, Nimrod is portrayed as the instigator of the Tower of Babel's construction. He did not just dream of a city, He dreamed of an empire, a totalitarian system where humanity no longer relied on God, but on a centralized authority led by him. Under Nimrod's leadership, the dream of Babel became reality, a society unified in language, purpose, and ambition. But this unity was not for divine purposes. It was to establish an eternal empire on earth, an impregnable system reaching to the heavens, where humanity could place itself on par with the Creator. The Tower of Babel, therefore, was not just a physical structure. It was the tangible symbol of Nimrod's spirit, the spirit of rebellion, the spirit of unity, not based on holiness, but on pride, and the ambition to dominate. Nimrod did not need to destroy the divine covenant with weapons. He only needed to replace it with a new vision, a world united not by faith, but by power and control. And that is what makes the event of Babel so terrifying. It was not the collapse of a tower, but the exposure of humanity's first collective rebellion, organized, led, and justified under the guise of progress and unity. Nimrod's emergence is a reminder that from the very beginning, pride and the craving for absolute control took root in human history, and they remain lurking in more subtle forms even today. In the vast plain of Shinar, a grand plan was set in motion, not just to build a place to live, but to assert the absolute power of humanity. The Tower of Babel was not merely a physical construction. It was humanity's first arrogant proclamation: build a city, erect a tower that reaches to the heavens. Genesis 11:4. Babel was not raised as a structure to sustain life, nor to honor God. It was a monument to human glory, a visible symbol of the ambition to transcend every limit God had set for their existence. When they said, "Let us make a name for ourselves," there was no trace of prayer, no sign of gratitude. Only the presumptuous will remained, channeling all strength into building an earthly paradise without God. The verb, erect a tower that reaches to the heavens, in the original Hebrew, implies more than physical height. It reflects an ambition to seize what belongs to the heavens, the realm reserved for the Creator alone. The Tower of Babel became a symbol of defiance. We will reach the heavens. We will determine our own fate. We will need no divine rule anymore. The story does not say they wanted to be close to God. They did not build the tower to worship. They built it to make a name for themselves, to create a world order no longer dependent on its divine source. A world built on pride, not humility, on strength, not faith. In this light, Babel was not just a city. It was the root of every collective effort to replace God with human systems, empires, political powers, unchecked globalization. It was the seed of every Babylon, every Rome, every ancient and modern empire, all bearing the mark of the desire to build a paradise without God. The Tower of Babel teaches us this: when humanity unites in ambition that defies limits, they do not build paradise. They only dig their own grave deeper under the weight of pride. The story of Babel, therefore, is not just a moral fable. It is a stern reminder that humanity's true progress lies not in reaching for the heavens to seize them, but in walking humbly, remembering that we only grow great when we take our rightful place in the divine order. When Genesis recounts that humanity wanted to erect a tower that reaches to the heavens, its meaning goes far beyond mere architectural ambition. Reaching the heavens was not just about measuring height or breaking physical boundaries. It was a symbol of a darker ambition to overthrow the divine order established by God at creation. The original Hebrew language suggests an invasion of the heavens' sovereignty, the eternal realm of God, which humanity in its finite nature was not permitted to claim. Reaching the heavens was not about conquering physical heights. It was a declaration that humanity could ascend to the throne, define its own standards, and establish a kingdom where their will replaced the Creator's. This ambition was not unique to Babel. It is a recurring theme throughout Scripture, from Lucifer, the fallen angel, who sought to set his throne above the stars, Isaiah 14:13, to earthly kingdoms seeking absolute rule without God. And Babel was the first archetype of this trend in human history. Reaching the heavens was also a denial of the limits of humanity's created nature. Instead of accepting their given role as God's image on earth, ruling under His guidance, humanity sought to become divine. It was the ultimate betrayal, a reenactment of Adam and Eve's sin in Eden. You will be like God, Genesis 3:5. If Eden was the fall of the individual, Babel was the fall of the collective. A civilization united in defiance of the Creator, striving to create a new heaven in their own image, without grace, without revelation, relying only on their own strength and will. But every attempt to reach the heavens with human hands ultimately leads to collapse, not because God fears human power, but because the very nature of such ambition carries the seeds of self-destruction. A society built on pride cannot endure. A civilization that rejects grace will rot from within. The Tower of Babel, with its dream of touching the heavens, became an eternal symbol of betrayal, not because of its height, but because of the depth of pride it exposed. And that lesson, recorded thousands of years ago, remains as relevant as ever, especially in a world today where humanity is once again building towers to crown itself. Reading the story of Babel closely, we uncover a terrifying detail often overlooked. They were not just building a tower. They were attempting to centralize all human power into a single point, creating a unified world order without God. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower. But the deeper reason is revealed immediately after, so that we may not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Genesis chapter 11:4. In other words, they knew God's command to scatter, multiply, and fill the earth, and they deliberately did the opposite. No scattering, no diversification, no submission to the divine flow. Instead, they centralized. They gathered, they united on their own terms, not God's. The city and tower were not just places to live or symbols of pride. They were tools for control, control of thought, action, and destiny. A single system, a single language, a single authority under leaders like Nimrod. A new world where dependence on the Creator was replaced by dependence on human power. The essence of this plan was not just arrogance. It was the creation of a spiritual tyranny, a world where humanity could no longer freely choose God, swept into an artificial order where all existence served the ultimate goal, the glory of man. In this light, the Tower of Babel was the prototype for all later forms of tyranny. Empires demanding absolute loyalty, political systems crushing individual freedom, societies where people become cogs in a vast machine serving a singular ambition. And God, in His infinite mercy, stopped it before it could fully form. He did what human eyes could not immediately see. He confused their language, disrupted their understanding, shattered their ability to unite in error. Not because He feared them, but because He knew that if their plan succeeded, humanity would bring upon itself a destruction worse than the flood, enslavement of the soul under its own yoke. When we grasp the essence of Babel, we realize that the greatest threat to humanity is not natural disasters or wars. The greatest threat is when humanity united, but misguided, chooses to centralize power to build an earthly paradise, but constructs it on the foundation of betraying the one who gave them life. And perhaps the warning of Babel still echoes today, as humanity once again dreams of global cities, new orders and towers promising power and unity, but risks the collapse of the soul if it lacks a divine foundation. The Bible is not the only source that speaks of Babel. When we delve into texts outside the canonical scriptures, like the Book of Jubilees, or cross-reference with ancient records from Sumerian civilization, a broader picture emerges. The Tower of Babel was not just a moral tale. It may have been the first global conspiracy in human history. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient text excluded from the official biblical canon but preserved by early communities, recounts that after the Great Flood, Noah's descendants, particularly his sons and their offspring, divided the world into regions to govern each assigned according to God's guidance. But Nimrod and his followers were not content with this division. They sought to unify power, to erase the boundaries God had set, and to build a single global kingdom under their rule. According to Jubilees, the construction of Babel was not just about reaching the heavens, but about forcing all of humanity into a unified order that defied the divine covenant. Meanwhile, from the Sumerian civilization, one of the earliest cultures in Mesopotamia, we find records of massive ziggurat towers built to reach the gods and establish human dominance under priest kings. Many scholars believe the biblical Tower of Babel may be linked to structures like Etemenanki, a famous ziggurat in Babylon, described as where heaven and earth meet. From both sources, a chilling truth emerges. Babel was not just a reflection of individual pride. It was a collective, organized project, a conspiracy to create a new global order where power was absolutely centralized in human hands, leaving no room for divine guidance. This was not just a city. It was the beginning of the imperial model, a system to gather control and ultimately enslave the human soul under the guise of unity and progress. And the most terrifying part, that conspiracy never died. Babel was only the first time humanity attempted such ambition on a global scale. But since then, how many times in history have dreams of empire, of new orders of towers reaching the heavens, risen again in new forms, each time more sophisticated, more expansive, but further from God? When we look to the Book of Jubilees, to Sumerian records, and compare them with the warnings of Scripture, we begin to understand that the Tower of Babel is not a closed story from the distant past. It is a dangerous path that humanity time and again has yet to abandon. If the Tower of Babel was truly an organized rebellion, a collective conspiracy to overthrow the divine order, then a haunting question arises. Are we in this age witnessing a reenactment of Babel in more sophisticated forms? Today, instead of bricks and mortar, we build towers with technology, global information systems, political and economic alliances, and even cultural unification. We speak of globalization, of erasing borders of a flat world, concepts that seem harmless, even noble on the surface. But beneath them, are we repeating the most dangerous dream of Babel uniting humanity under its own will without God? The modern world is moving toward unified information, a digital language and shared thought through global platforms. But what is troubling is this, that unity increasingly excludes the voice of faith, the laws of the divine, the reverence for a higher order. We see efforts to build global cities, plans to establish new orders based on economic, technological, and political power, all promising a world free of war, poverty, or injustice. But without a spiritual foundation, without God at the center, how will these differ from what happened in Shinar? Even more frightening, unlike ancient Babel today, we wield tools far more powerful. Artificial intelligence information, control weapons of mass destruction. Our ability to build towers has never been greater and never more dangerous. History is not just a linear flow, it is a series of cycles. And if the lesson of Babel is forgotten, if collective pride is once again cloaked in the garb of civilization, then this cycle may be leading us toward a collapse more catastrophic than any empire of the past. So the question for each of us is this: are we living in an age where Babel is being rebuilt? Are the invisible towers we erect today leading us toward a new division, not of language, but between humanity and its divine source? The answer lies not in grand declarations of the age. It lies in the vigilance of each soul. What are we building and for whom? In the story of the Tower of Babel, one detail is emphasized from the start. The whole world had one language and a common speech. Genesis 11:1. This is not a casual remark about language. It is the foundation for the entire tragedy about to unfold. For unified language in the context of Babel was not merely the ability to communicate. It was a profound agreement on goals, ambitions, and will, a globalized society not according to God's plan, but according to human desire. Language is the medium of thought. When all speak the same language, not only is speech unified, thought, values, and purposes are unified as well. There is no diversity, no need to negotiate, understand, or embrace differences. Instead, a collective will forms, and when that will no longer places God at its center, it becomes a dangerous tool for rebellion. The unified language at Babel enabled humanity to act as a single colossal unit, a single body driven by a single mind, but a mind of pride, self-exaltation, no longer submitting to divine will. A global society was established not to honor God, but to glorify humanity. This explains why God did not destroy them as in the flood. He broke their unity by confusing their language. For if it had continued, humanity would have gone too far in its rebellion, condemning itself to a deeper corruption with no way back. A unified language in the hands of a people estranged from God became a tool to centralize power, control thought, and impose will. and from that, a global society opposed to God, where individuals were dissolved into a rebellious collective, began to take shape. It is striking to compare this to our own time. A world moving toward a global language through technology, media shared symbols and values. A world where differences are seen as dangerous and thinking differently is viewed as a threat to collective stability. From the perspective of ancient Babel, we see the shadows of dangers rising, a new effort at unity, not to serve God, but to build a human kingdom without him. The Tower of Babel is thus not just a story of a brick tower, it is a mirror for every civilization that seeks to impose a global order with no place for the Creator. And that ancient lesson, if ignored, will once again lead humanity into the spiral of pride, rebellion, and collapse. When humanity gathered at Shinar to build the Tower of Babel, God saw what they could not just bricks stacked upon bricks, but a collective will silently growing to rebel against the divine order. But this time he did not destroy them as in the flood. He chose an act both profound and merciful. He broke their ability to unite to save them from their own self-destruction. If the flood of Noah was a cleansing of humanity through physical destruction, Babel was an intervention into the spiritual foundation, the ability of human minds to unite. Language was confused, understanding fractured, and groups were forced to scatter. No longer could they maintain absolute consensus for their prideful plan. No longer could a single mindset be so easily exploited by leaders like Nimrod. Humanity once again was compelled to scatter, multiply, and fill the earth as the Creator had originally intended. This was not mere punishment. It was a hidden act of salvation. By preventing their misguided unity, God stopped a path that led straight to spiritual destruction. A world united under pride would be a world with no escape. A totalitarian civilization would bind the human soul in chains of power, forever estranged from grace. The scattering of language opened the door to freedom. When nations differed, languages differed, and ways of understanding differed, the forces of absolute control were hindered. The diversity of culture, language, and thought became a natural barrier against any ambition to dominate all of humanity under a godless order. In this light, we see the mercy hidden in what seems like God's punishment. He did not destroy the rebels. He gave them a chance to spread out to seek him again through different paths, so that each nation, each civilization, through countless languages and expressions, could gradually find their way back to the one who created them. The Tower of Babel did not collapse because of weak architecture. It fell by the loving but firm hand of the one who knew that sometimes to save a child, a father must shatter its dangerous dreams before it burns itself to ashes. And today, every time humanity dreams of a new Babel, every time a new singular system rises to quietly dominate human thought and soul, the lesson of Shinar echoes true. Freedom does not come from outward unity, but from faithfulness to the divine order, the order that only God has the right to establish. The division of language at Babel was not a mere act of punishment, but carried a profound spiritual meaning, limiting human power to protect humanity from self-destruction. In the initial state after the Great Flood, humanity once again had the chance to build a new world under the light of the divine covenant. But within a few generations, ambition resurfaced. When all of humanity spoke one language and understood each other perfectly, their ability to unite for shared goals, good or evil, became nearly absolute. And at Babel, that shared goal was no longer to serve God, but to establish their own kingdom, to build a world order without him. This unity of language and will created a terrifying power, a civilization capable of manipulating thought, dominating souls, and silencing all dissent. Such a world would not only fail spiritually, but would inevitably collapse under its own pride and corruption. By dividing language, God imposed limits on the ability to unite, limits on the exercise of collective power. Different languages forced nations to scatter to develop diverse cultures and value systems, preventing the formation of an absolute, godless global power. The diversity of language and culture became a natural barrier against total tyranny. It forced humanity to learn dialogue, negotiation, and understanding through differences, a tiring but necessary process to preserve true freedom. And in that division, there was an opportunity for each nation, each culture to find its own path back to God, instead of being swept into a counterfeit order where the human soul was dissolved into a misguided collective will. The limit of language, therefore, was not a curse. It was a hidden grace, a spiritual brake on the engine of human power, keeping it from hurtling into the abyss of self-importance and rebellion. The story of Babel reminds us that true freedom does not come from breaking all limits, but from living within the wise limits. God has set limits that keep the human heart mindful of its divine origin and prevent it from turning itself into a god in vain delusion. When the Tower of Babel collapsed and humanity scattered across the earth, the story seems to end. But the spirit of Babel, the spirit of rebellion against God, the spirit of building an earthly kingdom to replace the divine one, did not vanish. It only transformed, hiding within new civilizations, taking on more subtle forms, but with the same essence. Nimrod, the instigator of Babel, was not just a figure of one era. He is the archetype of every leader, every empire that nurtures the dream of uniting humanity under earthly power. The shadow of Nimrod, with his ambition to build a totalitarian system from Shinar, looms strangely over the history of the first great civilizations. Babylon, founded on the same land of Shinar, quickly became the first symbol of a mighty empire. Its impregnable walls, its hanging gardens, and the Tower of Etemenanke, a massive ziggurat believed to be inspired by the memory of Babel, all testified that the spirit of Babel not only survived but rose stronger. Babylon was not just a city, it was a declaration of pride. I will reign above the stars of God. Egypt, with its majestic pyramids and pharaohs claiming to be living gods, was another reenactment of Babel's spirit. A society where divine authority was personified, where humanity placed itself in a sacred role and demanded the people's service in the name of immortality. Greece, with all its sophistication in philosophy and art, could not escape this shadow. As city-states sought to expand their influence, as philosophers like Protagoras declared, man is the measure of all things, the spirit of Babel, placing humanity at the center, instead of God, rose once more through every empire, every dynasty. Nimrod lingers like a spectre behind the crowns, the conquests, the declarations of golden ages for humanity. But each time history witnesses the same outcome. Pride leads to decline, and the building of earthly kingdoms without the divine covenant ends in chaos. The story of Babel, therefore, did not end in the plain of Shinar. It continues in every human effort to create a paradise of their own, only to realize that no paradise endures when built on the foundation of pride. And that lesson, echoing through the ruins of Babylon, Egypt, and Greece, remains as weighty for the modern world today. The Tower of Babel is not just a singular event in sacred history. It is an enduring pattern, a warning of a dangerous law. Wherever absolute power is concentrated in human hands, there spiritual rebellion quietly grows. After Babel, human history repeatedly saw empires rise with the same spirit, centralizing power, unifying thought, eliminating dependence on God. From ancient kingdoms like Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt, to the glorious empire of Rome, and further to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, the Babel model keeps reappearing. What is clear is that every time power becomes absolute, every time a group declares they can create paradise on earth without God, the result is the same: oppression, corruption, and ultimately collapse. Babel was only the beginning of this bitter chain of lessons. Ancient empires often deified their leaders. Egyptian pharaohs called themselves living gods. Babylonian emperors claimed to represent the gods. Rome worshipped Caesar as a deity to be served. And in modern times we have seen authoritarian regimes, whether in the name of nation, race, or ideology, build their own towers of Babel, a world where human power is no longer restrained by conscience, faith, or fear of the Creator. Each time forced unity and absolute control did not lead to lasting glory. They led to the destruction of the individual soul, the loss of freedom, and ultimately rebellion from within. For the human soul, no matter how oppressed, quietly remembers. It was created for freedom, a freedom that exists only when humanity lives in right relationship with God. The lasting impact of Babel therefore lies not only in the ruins of ancient ziggurats. It lives in the painful lessons of history. Any system, no matter how grand, that places itself above God carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And as we look at the world today, dreams of globalized order, efforts to unify culture, thought and belief, the quiet echo of Babel remains unsilenced. The question for us is not just, what are we building, but also, on what foundation are we building faithfulness to God or our own pride? When we broaden our view beyond the canonical scriptures, we encounter ancient texts like the Book of Jasher, the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of Enoch, texts once circulated among early faith communities, but later excluded from the official canon. And in these texts, the story of Nimrod and the conspiracy of Babel emerges with deeper, more astonishing details. In the Book of Jasher, Nimrod is not merely described as a hero or hunter. He is painted as a tyrannical ruler, the first empire builder who controlled not only lands through strength, but human minds through fear and cultural assimilation. Nimrod gathered humanity under his rule, compelling them to join the tower's construction not as an honor, but as a mandatory duty. The Tower of Babel, under Nimrod's banner, became the symbol of a systematically organized collective rebellion aimed at building an eternal earthly kingdom in defiance of God's intent. The Book of Jubilees goes further, detailing how Noah's descendants were assigned territories after the flood, a division ordained by God himself. But Nimrod and his followers rejected this arrangement, plotting instead to keep humanity in Shinar, building Babel to control and challenge the divine order established from the beginning. Their action was not mere disobedience, but a deliberate erasure of the covenant. In the Book of Enoch, though, Nimrod is not named directly. The spirit of rebellion in that era is tied to a broader corruption, the rise of the Watchers, the spread of forbidden knowledge, the expansion of greed and pride across the earth. The Tower of Babel in Enoch's light is not just a physical structure, but the crest of a metaphysical rebellion, a collective effort to break free from divine dependence and create a kingdom of man instead of God. These details from the forbidden books reveal Nimrod was not just a vague historical figure. He is a vivid symbol of every power system that rises to usurp God's role in human life. He is the first shadow of the Antichrist spirit, the spirit that seeks to unite humanity, not through covenant, but through power, not through love, but through control. And from Babel to today, that lesson remains urgent. Any civilization built on pride, any dream of unity that does not point to God, will ultimately lead to division, chaos, and collapse. The Tower of Babel fell, but its spirit, the spirit of rebellion against God and the desire to build an earthly kingdom without him, never vanished. The prophets throughout Scripture saw that Babel was not just a past event, but a metaphor for what would come at the end of time. In the Book of Revelation, chapters 17 and 18, Babylon the Great appears as the ultimate symbol of corruption, rebellion, and human power pushed to its extreme. The Babylon of Revelation is not just a physical city. It is a global system where commerce, politics, religion, and culture merge into a unified entity to replace God's place in the human heart. Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the earth's abominations. Revelation 17:5. This stark description reveals that the final Babel system will be built not on holiness, but on the trading of souls, on the worship of power, wealth, and earthly pleasure. Once again, Nimrod's dream of a global kingdom without God will be tested, this time on an unprecedented scale. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel also foretold the fall of Babylon as a reminder that every empire built on pride and divine disobedience will face God's judgment. Not just the historical Babylon, but every Babylon in every age, every system that tries to replace God with human power is marching toward destruction. Revelation shows that at the end of time, the world will rally around a counterfeit global order led by the Antichrist, a figure who will echo Nimrod's spirit, proclaiming himself Lord and demanding worship. But just as Babel was broken by God in the past, the final Babylon will be overthrown in his righteous wrath. She will be destroyed in a single day by fire, by the judgment of God the Almighty. Revelation 18:8. The Tower of Babel does not only warn of the past, it outlines a destined pattern for humanity. If we once again choose to build a world without God, Unity will lead to corruption, power to tyranny, and judgment will be inescapable. In the light of the prophets, Babel is not just the rubble of an ancient tower, it is a mirror reflecting the final fate of every civilization built on pride and a desperate call to humanity. Return to the divine covenant before the tower falls again, this time forever. The Tower of Babel is not just an ancient history recorded for moral instruction. It is a living prophecy echoing through every age about the inevitable fate of civilizations that choose pride over faithfulness to the Creator. From Shinar to Babylon, from Rome to the great empires of today, the Babel pattern repeats in a familiar spiral. Humanity unites not to worship God, but to build kingdoms of their own. People combine not to enact divine mercy and justice, but to pursue power, control, and earthly glory. Each time the outcome is the same. When humanity forgets its divine origin, when they proclaim they need no God, when they try to establish their own order apart from grace, collapse is inevitable. Not because God is petty or jealous, but because the very order of the universe cannot sustain a civilization built on betraying its created nature. Babel fell not only because language was confused, it fell because the collective will of humanity severed the spiritual lifeline connecting them to their Maker, and every other civilization, no matter how mighty, how advanced, that walks the same path is heading toward the same end, Babel. Therefore is a timeless warning. It shows us that the greatest danger is not a lack of resources or technological weakness. The greatest danger is pride, the silent but deadly virus that leads humanity to view itself as the center of the universe. Today, as the world increasingly dreams of absolute unity, of vast globalized systems, of a humanity needing no religion, no covenant, only scientific progress and governance, the prophecy of Babel becomes more urgent than ever. Babel reminds us that no civilization, no structure, no empire can endure if it is not built on the foundation of faithfulness to God. Everything else, no matter how tall, how vast, how dazzling, will ultimately become rubble at the feet of history. And in the faint echo of that fallen tower from long ago, a quiet question remains for every age. Are we building for the glory of whom, for the Eternal One, or for our own fragile selves? Looking at the modern world, we cannot help but ask, are we reenacting Babel in more sophisticated forms? Are we in our civilization today, with globalization, with information control, with dreams of absolute unity, once again stepping onto the path that Babel began today? Technology has erased national borders, connecting billions in a vast web of information. A common language is emerging, not of speech, but of data, symbols, and thought. Global values, international standards, and worldwide agreements increasingly shape how we think, believe, and act. But the piercing question is, where is all this unity heading? Is it aimed at honoring God, respecting the divine covenant, awakening humility and faithfulness in human hearts? Or is it gradually leading humanity to a world where people see themselves as the ultimate pinnacle, where God is excluded from every system of thought, where progress is worshipped instead of truth? There are growing signs that within modern civilization, A new Babel dream simmers, a dream of a humanity united under human power, needing no grace, no revelation, only itself. Information control grows ever more sophisticated. Standards of thought are increasingly shaped in a uniform direction. Voices of dissent, especially those reminding us of God, of the divine order, are increasingly seen as outdated obstacles to progress. A new order is quietly forming, not with swords, but with language, images and lifestyles replicated worldwide. And just as in Shinar long ago, we are witnessing a collective effort to build a new Tower of Babel, a global order not based on worshipping God, but on worshipping humanity. But if the ancient Babel was halted by an unseen hand, if language was scattered to protect the human soul from collective enslavement, will another divine intervention await us ahead? And the question for every awake soul is this: are we helping build the new Babel, or are we quietly seeking the path back to the divine covenant where true freedom is found? If we view the entire story of Babel not as an isolated event, but as a mirror for humanity's whole journey, a larger picture emerges: a silent but fierce battle between humanity's prideful will and the call to return to the divine covenant. From Eden to Babel, from ancient Babylon to today's globalized world, the song of human pride has never stopped playing. It is the same old desire to build a world without God, where humanity sets its own moral standards, grants itself the right to life, death, and truth. The same old ambition. We will make a name for ourselves. We will build our own city and tower. We will reach the heavens. But alongside that melody throughout history, another call persists, smaller, humbler, but never silent. The call of the divine covenant. The call reminding us that we were created not to rule the heavens, but to walk in the light of the one who loved us before we were formed in the womb. The call inviting humanity to abandon the ambition of building fleeting towers and return to true relationship, a relationship not based on power, but on faith and love. Today, as the world stands at the threshold of a new order, with all the dazzle of technology, knowledge, and centralized power, that battle has never been clearer. On one side is the seductive call of human power, inviting us to unite in pride, in self-satisfaction, in the illusion of an earthly paradise of our own making. On the other is the whisper of the ancient covenant, calling us to humbly acknowledge our limits, to hear God's voice in the scattering, to seek Him not through towering heights, but in the simplicity of an obedient heart. And the question for each person is no longer a fairy tale from long ago. It is an urgent question. Which side will you stand on? Will you build with Babel in the belief that humanity can save itself? Or will you return step by step, decision by decision, small act by small act, to live within the divine covenant, though its path is narrower, quieter, and demands more? In that final battle, no one stands on the sidelines. Every heart is a battlefield. Every choice is a brick, either for Babel or for the eternal kingdom. As we reflect on the journey we have explored together, one truth stands clear. The Tower of Babel was not just an architectural failure, it was a spiritual turning point, an event that shaped the spiritual destiny of all humanity. It was not just broken bricks or an unfinished tower, but a deep fracture in the relationship between humanity and God. A fracture we have yet to fully heal. At Babel, for the first time since the Great Flood, humanity united to oppose the one who created them. And from that moment, human history entered a new chapter, a chapter of scattering, of endless attempts to unite without God, of grand dreams to build paradise on earth, only to crumble time and again in disappointment and pain. Today, as the world once more yearns for global unity, as new towers of Babel are quietly raised with technology, economic power, and sophisticated systems of control, the ancient question rings out: who will dare to hear the voice from that fallen tower of long ago? Who will pause amid the whirlwind of progress, amid the sweetness of pride, to hear the quiet lesson that Babel's ruins still whisper to those brave enough to listen? For that lesson is never outdated. Humanity's true greatness lies not in reaching the heights of power, but in humble faithfulness to the one who made the heavens and the earth. We were created not to build towers that pierce the sky, but to build simple, faithful lives that reflect the light of the Eternal One. We are called not to make a name for ourselves on earth, but to have our names written in the heart of God. And as the world races toward new Babels, each of us must choose. Will we add a brick to the fleeting towers, or will we quietly build a sacred temple in our hearts where God still waits? The story of Babel is not over. It continues in every decision, every dream, every action we take today. Amen.